Were the Nazis socialist? Of course not, say the socialists. They were the opposite. Socialists are left-wing, but the Nazis were right-wing. And right-wing, according to the socialists, means, well, what does it mean? Were the Nazis in favour of light taxation? Small state, free market capitalism? The BBC, Britain's state broadcaster, describes Charlie Kirk as far-right. In America, he was maligned as a Nazi many times by journalists and academics. They called him, rather strangely, literally Hitler. His events were apparently like Nazi rallies. Charlie Kirk believed in open debate, free speech, individual freedom, free markets, small limited government, the right of ordinary citizens to bear arms as a guarantee against state tyranny. He was a Christian and also a vocal champion of Jews and Israel against the attacks of anti-Semites. The Nazis, on the other hand, forbade open debate, enforced censorship in all forms of media, and ultimately imposed direct state control of media. Like all tyrannical governments, they imposed gun control, worshipped the state and state power. They favoured high taxes and state regulation of economic activities, stamped out individual freedom, loathed Christianity, and killed millions of Jews. In short, in almost every conceivable way, the views of the Nazis were diametrically opposed to those of Charlie Kirk's. Kirk's socialist critics, on the other hand, well, for the most part, they believe in censorship in the media and in schools and universities. In socialist Britain, the state controls most news output and sends the police to arrest people who say the wrong things on social media. Socialists want higher taxes, pour scorn on individual freedom, want greater state control of people and of the economy, including digital ID and surveillance. They want gun control, they're derisive of Christian values, and express support for people who killed Jews. And the more far left you are, the more rabid these views become. To state the obvious, in all the above ways the views of the far left are indeed the opposite of Charlie Kirk's, but align perfectly with those of the Nazis. In my last film I dealt with the sinister ideology of environmentalism, which the Nazis more or less invented, and to which modern socialists are feverishly attached. In this film, I want to deal with a question that keeps being raised, often by people who really don't know what they're talking about. Were the Nazis socialist? And I'm going to spoil the surprise by saying yes. Nazis, I think we can all agree, have a pretty bad rep. Sterilization, conducting lethal experiments on children and women, the gas chambers, wiping out a large part of Europe's Jewish population. Not good. I can quite understand why socialists today don't want to be told they're quite like the Nazis. Why they would prefer to call their opponents Nazis. Why they might even argue that the Nazis sit at the opposite end of the political spectrum to socialism. Nazis and socialism. Nothing to do with each other. But straight away we hit a snag. Nazi is, of course, an abbreviation. The full name of Hitler's party was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The movement was called, by the Nazis themselves, National Socialism. Adolf Hitler, introducing the Nazi Party's manifesto, said, "Today's bourgeoisie is rotten to the core. We demand the nationalization of all public companies, in other words, socialization, or what is known here as socialism." Hitler leaves us in no doubt. In his follow-up book to Mein Kampf, he declares proudly, "I am a socialist." In fact, in the Reichstag, he declared, "I am a fanatical socialist. I've been striving for 20 years to arrive at a new socialist order in Germany." In 1941, as war was raging, Hitler declared, "The German National Socialist State will tirelessly work for the creation of a true socialist community." Mein Kampf describes in damning terms the awful effects of the advent of industrial capitalism, alienating and impoverishing factory workers. He hankers after the German society of the olden days, before it was poisoned by Jewish capitalism. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, who started out as a socialist university academic, loathed capitalism. The worker in a capitalist state, and that is his deepest misfortune, is no longer a living human being, a creator, a maker. He has become a machine, a number, a cog in the machine. The first ever fascist party was set up not by Hitler, but by Mussolini, who was, until then, a senior member of the Italian Socialist Party. He was on the National Executive Committee of the Italian Socialist Party. He was even editor of Italy's famous socialist newspaper, Avanti. The only reason he split with the Socialist Party was because Mussolini supported entry into the First World War. As fascist dictator, Mussolini explicitly attacked capitalism, mass production, individualism, and laissez-faire economics. He called capitalists exploiters and parasites, and said, with fascism, the capitalist mode of production has been superseded. Oswald Mosley, who founded the British Fascist Party, was a Socialist Labour Member of Parliament. He had even served in the Socialist Labour government. He was personal friends with many of the great socialist intellectuals of his day. And yet they ask us to believe that National Socialism is nothing to do with socialism. Let's look at the basics, at economics. The great hero of socialist economics still is John Maynard Keynes, who advocated high taxes, government borrowing, printing money, and extensive state control of the economy. Keynes, as it happens, was a good friend of Oswald Mosley, head of the British Fascist Party. There are records of them having dinners and lunches together. Keynes advised Mosley on economic policies for his manifesto, and even promised to vote for his party. In the introduction to the German edition of Keynes's main work on economics, Keynes said how much he admired Nazi economics, which most closely reflected his views. Germany, under the Nazis, was the most heavily taxed society in Europe, and outside the Soviet Union, the most regulated. In the words of the historian Adam Tooze, the first years of Hitler's regime saw the imposition of a series of controls on German business that were unprecedented in peacetime history. By the way, hope you're enjoying guerrilla science. Our films are unusual, we're told. We say things that are rarely if ever said. Nowhere else on the net will you find films with our kind of perspective and analysis, which is great. But to carry on, guess what? We need your help. First, I hate to say it, money. We have a Patreon, so please become a patron for ad-free early access videos where you get a credit at the end. And second, search engine algorithms seem to go on strike when you put out climate skeptic stuff like ours. So please share our films, tell your friends and enemies, help us build audience and spread the word. Thank you for watching. Nazi regulation of the economy was extraordinary. In its first 2 years in power, the party issued, on average, a new regulation every 3 days covering the farming industry alone. When all this regulation inevitably led to rising prices, the Nazi government did what all socialist governments do and attempted to impose extensive price controls, leading inevitably to reduced output and chronic shortages. In many industries, private sector workers were laid off. Between 1933 and 1938, the number of people employed shrank by 6% in mining, 7% in commerce, 16% in textile manufacturing, 21% in agriculture. But, typical of all socialist governments, there was one boom area. Employment in the public sector expanded by 69%. Under the Nazis, in just 5 years, the budget for ministries connected with war, of course, increased tenfold, but others increased even more. The budget for the Ministry of the Interior increased 20-fold, of the Ministry of Justice 36 times. This was state bureaucrat heaven. As one historian says, career-minded entrants to the civil service could not but welcome the Nazi expansion of the bureaucratic apparatus, which doubled career opportunities in government administration within the space of 8 years. The Nazis worshipped the state. They wanted a massive, well-funded, all-controlling state. Rexford Tugwell, one of the main architects of the Socialist New Deal, said he admired Italian fascism for this very reason. Roosevelt called Mussolini that admirable Italian gentleman, and said he was deeply impressed by what Mussolini has accomplished. So much for the economy. How about other policy areas? Today's socialists are committed environmentalists. It's industrial capitalism versus nature, as indeed it was for the anti-capitalist Nazis. I've covered this in another film. The Nazis created the world's first nature reserves. Hitler advocated renewable energy of water, winds and tides. The Nazis were vegetarians and promoted homeopathic alternative medicine and organic farming. Hermann Goering declared a total ban on animal vivisection. Instead, they would carry out the most sickening lethal experiments on Jewish children, pregnant Jewish women, and so on. The Nazis valued nature above human life. They invented environmentalism. Literally. The socialists say, but the Nazis were totalitarian. But so were the socialists at the time, as indeed, arguably, are socialists today. H.G. Wells, perhaps the most famous socialist of the 1920s and 30s, at the very heart of the socialist intelligentsia in Britain and America, wanted a society just like the Nazis built. He imagined a university-educated bureaucratic elite which would control society completely. An intelligent minority of expert administrators would run a great central organization, which would tell people what had best be done here, there, and everywhere. This would require a deliberate collective control of population as a primary condition. This would include limits on the general right of free movement. To facilitate this, every citizen would be forced to carry an unfalsifiable identity card, the details of which would be on a world government database, with their activities monitored by the Central Observation Bureau. The total power of the state would enable it to thrust its inquiring and compelling fingers more and more intimately into the recesses of human life. For Wells, the ideal state was the world state, inescapable, and the governing bureaucratic World Council would have the supreme advantage of holding all communications in its hands. This would lead to a ruthless mental disinfection of the world. Unclean thoughts would be purged. Ah, say the Socialists, the Nazis weren't just totalitarian, they also murdered masses of people. They were eugenicists. But so too were socialists of the day in Britain and America. The great socialist H.G. Wells, for example, said that masses of the human population are, as a whole, inferior in their claim upon the future. What should society do, he asked, with its congenital invalids, its idiots and madmen, its drunkards and men of vicious mind, its stupid people too stupid to be of use to the community, its lumpish, unteachable and unimaginative people? His terrifying answer is, the species must be engaged in eliminating them. The socialist George Bernard Shaw said the same thing in a famous clip.
There are an extraordinary number of people whom I want to kill, who are no use in this world. I think it would be a good thing to make everybody come before a properly appointed board and say, "Sir or Madam, now will you be kind enough to justify your existence? If you can't justify your existence, if you're not pulling your weight in the social boat, then clearly we cannot use the big organization of our society for the purpose of keeping you alive."
In a foretaste of the Holocaust, the socialist D.H. Lawrence imagined using poisoned gas. I would build a lethal chamber as big as Crystal Palace, then I'd go out into the back streets and the main streets and bring them in, all the sick and the halt and the maimed. I would lead them gently and they would smile me a weary thanks. Socialists of the time literally suggested killing undesirables in huge gas chambers. The most disgusting eugenicist views were held by many socialists in the Fabian Society and beyond, by Wells, Shaw, Keynes, Lasky, the Webbs, Beveridge, and many of their socialist counterparts in America. Ah, say the socialists, but the Nazis were anti-Semitic. The Nazi hatred of the Jews was part and parcel of their socialist hatred of capitalism. Hitler said Jews are biologically predisposed to mercantile activity. Obviously, the Jew thinks as a capitalist. Socialists have associated capitalism with Jewishness from the get-go. Karl Marx said that money is the zealous one God of Israel. What is the foundation of the Jew in our world? Private advantage. What is the object of Jewish worship? Usury. Emancipation from usury and money, that is, from Judaism, would constitute the emancipation of our time. The Marxist Werner Sombart, in his revolting book The Jews and Modern Capitalism, says that the Jewish character represents the purest form of capitalism. Sombart went on to join the Nazi Party. Jews were so disliked by Marxists and Nazis alike precisely because of their participation in free market, industrial and commercial capitalism. Ah, say the socialists. But the Nazis can't have been socialist because they did not enjoy the support of the working class. But this is true of socialists today. Among white blue-collar workers in the US, twice as many vote Republican as Democrat. The gun-toting, Bible-reading lower orders love Trump. It's the intelligentsia that goes for the likes of Hillary Clinton. In Britain, the pro-capitalist parties, Reform and Tory, enjoy 3 times as much working-class support as socialist Labour. Today's socialists advocate energy policies that make ordinary people poorer. The left pours scorn on industrial agriculture that makes food cheaper, on mass tourism, in other words, working-class people going abroad, on mass production and mass consumption, everything that the masses themselves enjoy and benefit from. Today's socialists hate the masses, and the masses hate them right back. Where did the Nazis find their main support? From the civil service, from teachers, from university professors, from university students, from conservationists. As one historian points out, By 1931, support for Nazism at the universities was proportionately twice as great as among the general population. The civil service and teaching professions were among the biggest groups within the Nazi Party, making up more than a third of the most senior layers of the party. Of Germany's many nature conservation groups, in other words, German Greens, 60% were members of the Nazi Party. Only 1 in 5 Prussian civil servants was not a member of the Nazi Party. The Nazis worshipped the state, and they were supported by those who identified with and relied most on the state for their status and income. In short, the social basis for the Nazis, support for the Nazis, came from the exact same groups that support socialism today. Socialists today advocate compulsory digital ID, surveillance cameras to protect the environment, regulation and censorship of the media. They support state control of news output and broadcasting, Britain's BBC. In Britain, the socialist government has started arresting people for tweeting things of which they disapprove. They lean on social media platforms to suppress climate skepticism and other views which they dislike. People in publishing houses and universities and other areas that step out of line are handed out of their jobs. Do I even have to say it? This is exactly what the Nazis did. The Nazis believed in indoctrination in schools, which is exactly what socialists today believe in. Socialists today say they don't hate Jews, they hate Israel. But they support people who say without shame that they would like to kill all the Jews, and indeed who crossed into Israel to rape and murder scores of innocent Jews. The socialists march alongside these people. They have adopted their slogans. If we're serious about learning the lessons of history, we really cannot have socialists telling us that the Nazis weren't socialist. They were, and they are. My name is Matin Durkin, and this is Guerrilla Science.